Hello, I am Tara Cushing, a fellow at the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. I am joined by Mr. Bies, who will be at the 2022 Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College Summer Conference, where he will be presenting on battlefield archaeology at Manassas. Would you like to introduce yourself further?
Sure. So again, I'm Brandon Bies. I'm the superintendent of Manassas National Battlefield Park. I've been the superintendent here at Manassas for just under 5 years. And it's a fantastic park to work at, particularly given my own background and interest in the American Civil War and my background, my education in military archaeology and historical archaeology. And so we have a lot of really neat things we've done here at Manassas and at battlefields throughout the Park Service, and lots of neat archaeology to share.
Great. So what was the motivation or reasoning behind the recent archaeological work at Manassas?
Sure. So we've got a couple things that have been going on, and I think I'll be talking about probably both of them, but more so, really unprecedented discovery is what I'll be focusing on, I think, which is not the way archaeology frequently happens, but it was an unintentional discovery. Our park staff parks have to run infrastructure and things like that. And they had done some archaeology in advance to make sure, doing the right thing, that we weren't going to disturb any archaeological sites or anything. And they didn't find anything. Of course, you never really know for certain unless you dig the entire testing didn't show anything. When they did the work, there was an archaeologist there that was monitoring, and they started to discover things coming out in the dirt pile, and that's what first led them to realize that they were on the site of an archaeological site of major significance to the American Civil War.
That's really cool. Um, And how does, archaeology and that side of research, as opposed to traditional historical research, kind of inform or change the way that history is interpreted, especially at where you work, Manassas?
Sure. Yeah. So it's certainly the historical record informs the archaeology, helps us figure out where we might want to look for things or might explain what we find. But again, the archaeological record sometimes clarifies or changes the way we perceive things to be from the written record. I'll give a few examples, kind of maybe going both directions here. There's been times where we have been doing archaeology on the battlefield, doing systematic metal detector surveys, where we have found, say, a certain type of artillery that was being fired, specifically like a canister that was being fired. You would only fire that in kind of a close range situation. And this was an area of the park where we didn't think there was terribly close range fighting. And so the archaeological record, right, the artifacts in the ground don't really lie, showed us that perhaps our understanding based off of the written record may not have been entirely accurate. Maybe in this case, the Union troops on the left flank of this large charge and advance actually were closer to some of the Confederate artillery batteries than we interpreted from the historical record. Finding canister shot that really would have only been fired within a few hundred yards of that position. So that was a case of the archaeology informing the historical record. But we've got other examples kind of going the other way. Of a Union surgeon's pit. It was literally a pit full of amputated limbs and a couple of intact, more or less intact Union soldiers. And one of our biggest questions was, were these soldiers from the first battle or the second battle? Were they Union? Were they Confederate? Well, one of these soldiers had a almost certainly soldiers from the second battle, because we know from the historical records that that type of weapon was really not used during the first battle, right? So that's, Manassas is a neat place. We had two battles that happened here 13 months apart from each other, and the equipment were somewhat different at times. And so that's a case for the historical record, these records from the individual regiments saying what types of weapons they carried. That really helped inform understanding that these were bodies from the second battle, because there was a bullet lodged in one of them that you wouldn't have found at the first battle, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So yeah, what kind of, not just at Manassas, but what do you think like broader understandings about the Civil War can be learned through archaeology, like you were saying, kind of the weapons and such, but is there more on like, kind of medicine or like even other areas?
I'm sorry, Tara, I lost that. My connection froze. I lost the very end of your question. You were asking kind of about bigger picture Civil War things we can learn about the time period of the Civil War on battlefields and archaeology.
Yeah, so not just like the physical fighting. Is there other things that we can learn from the archaeology, such as like the medicine, or
Yeah.
other practices that maybe aren't kind of written or in the normal historical record like that?
Sure. So another thing that I've had the opportunity to work a lot on at a battlefield, at Monocacy Battlefield in Frederick, Maryland, was not so much related to the battle itself, but to the long-term use of this railroad junction and crossroads and outside of Frederick that had significant occupation of Civil War soldiers for much of the war. And there was a particular regiment that was stationed there for almost a year, and they had built a permanent, more or less, encampment. And so I led a project to try to find that encampment, see what we could tell about it, how it was constructed, and what the soldiers' lives were like. And so this was a case where we were finding the huts that they lived in. These would have been log huts that would have had 2 or 4 soldiers in each one. And we were able to find the individual company cookhouses at the end of each company street. And so we could go and look at their trash pits and determine what their diet's like, how much meat they were getting, what the cuts of meat were like, whether it was beef or pork, those kinds of things. We were able to look at what they might have also been supplementing their diets with. If you found discarded old, cans of canned goods and things that they were bringing in, things that they might have been privately purchasing from stores and sutlers. So just looking at something like a trash pit from a Civil War camp can tell you a great deal about those soldiers. And you can also start to look for things like, well, were there differences in the meals that the enlisted men were having versus the officers? Because the officers, they were actually responsible for, in many cases, purchasing or paying for their own food, whereas the enlisted men had the food provided for them by the Army. And so looking up the different trash pits and seeing if you can see differences and things like that. So that's a very specific example, but yeah, you can learn all kinds of things, whether it be diet, how they pass their free time, how they decided to have their own personal decisions about how they made their living space. There weren't regulations for how to build a hut. They might make it a certain shape out of certain materials, and you can learn things about ingenuity and whatnot. So yeah, you can look at all kinds of things about the Civil War, well beyond just the combat.
Yeah, I never would have thought of the difference in meals or anything. So that's super interesting. Um, and were there any other like surprises or unexpected finds
You mean in that particular project?
in that particular one? Really, any of the projects that you've done, is there anything that's been like super surprising?
And I'm sorry, I can see you talking, but I couldn't hear what you said there. But I'll tell you a neat story anyhow about something that was one of the neater things that I've discovered in my times. Again, that surgeon's pit that I talked about, that I'm largely going to be talking about at Gettysburg. is the most amazing thing I have ever worked on. But something else that is really neat was, again, when we were doing work at Monocacy, we were doing systematic metal detector surveys of areas that had had combat, but also had had campsites. And we had a target and we excavated it. And at first I thought it was the base of a shotgun shell, but we cleaned it off and it was actually the lip, the mouth of a Union canteen. And we looked at that. We were able to clean it off, and the soldier had inscribed in it LT period HART period 128. So it looked like Lieutenant Hart of the 128th some regiment. Well, there weren't a whole lot of regiments in the war. There weren't a whole lot of states that were big enough to have at least 128 regiments. I'm originally from Delaware, and unfortunately, there were not 128 regiments from the state of Delaware. But look at states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and fairly quickly we were able to identify exactly who this soldier was, Lieutenant Ambrose B. Hart of the 128th New York. And we were able to determine that the 128th New York, looking at the historical records, had camped on this exact spot and I've since forgotten the exact dates, but it was basically a 24 to 48 hour period in August of 1864 on their way marching into the Shenandoah Valley and to ultimately fight in the Third Battle of Winchester, where Lieutenant Hart was severely wounded in the leg and disabled, I believe, for the rest of the Civil War. And so to have something that you can make that personal connection. We later found a photograph of him. And so to be able to hold something in your hand that an individual, to within a day when that person lost it, and then just a week later that their life was changed forever by being so severely wounded, it just, it really helps to personalize what otherwise might be kind of like an inanimate object that you find in the ground.
Yeah. And I think it's great that you could kind of give people who maybe aren't very important, like through this one object that you found, you give them a sense of importance and show that, yes, they were there and they did participate and they were kind of important.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, whether it be somebody like that, or again, you're going and looking at one of these hut sites where soldiers, because let's face it, most soldiers on both sides spent the bulk of the non-campaigning season, the winter, in kind of permanent camps and looking at their writing. That's when they did most of their writing, and that's where they left most of the archaeological record about their lives. And so, again, it really gives us an opportunity to learn about the common soldiers of the Civil War, which has always been a real interest to me.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think this recent work might or could shape other parks' approaches to combining this archaeology and traditional history approach to uncover more about a site's history?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful that we've moved to the point now in the history field and the archaeology field where we recognize the benefits of battlefield archaeology, but also, and I'll go off a little bit here, more and more battlefields are starting to look at the fact that while the reason that battlefield, that national park in many cases exists, is because of that 1, 2, 3 days in human history where a really crucial event happened, the Battle of Gettysburg, a battle at Manassas. But the reality is, on those battlefields, there were a lot of people who lived there before, during, and after the Civil War. And so archaeology is one of those ways to learn about those people. And so at places like, and I'm admittedly not as familiar at Gettysburg, but at places like Monocacy in Frederick, Maryland, or here at Manassas, we've started to use archaeology as one of the ways to give voice to the large African American communities who lived, and in many cases were enslaved on these lands before and up to the Civil War. And so places, a lot of these battlefields had huge slaveholding plantations on them. And again, there's so little that survives, that was written by those enslaved individuals themselves, that the archaeology of those places is one of the only ways we can find out about their lives, and again, and give them a voice. And the correlation back to Civil War archaeology on this is one of the tools that we use a lot of in battlefield archaeology is a metal detector, right? You can use a metal detector to look for bullets, and we map them all out, and we can look at troop lines and things like that based off of all where the dropped and fired bullets were. Well, you can do the same thing. Metal detectors just don't look for bullets. You can find nails and hardware and things like that. And so we're starting to use that as a technique to find a lot of important sites that were not documented, like slave villages and things on battlefields. We use kind of traditional battlefield archaeology techniques to find these other important sites that existed there.
Yeah, and I think that is true for like a lot of the other sites too, where they're trying to like branch out beyond just the battlefield. I know here at Gettysburg, there's a class that's gonna excavate the house of one of the Black owners in town and try and learn more about him, because there isn't as much history. And I think it is very important to hear about all of the background characters who maybe wouldn't notice but are still super important to the overall history. Well, thank you for joining me today. And make sure to go see him at the Civil War Institute Summer Conference to hear more about his talk on the battlefield archaeology of Manassas. Do you have anything else to say?
No, just really excited to be able to give the presentation, and again, especially unveil some really neat things that we found here at Manassas about this surgeon's pit that just changed the way we looked in some ways at medicine during the Civil War. So come join us for that, and you'll learn a lot more about critical decisions that were made, really tough decisions made by these surgeons trying to save Civil War soldiers during battles.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Nice chatting.